It's a great day. Welcome to That's Great IT, your one-stop place to learn about ITOps by turning IT noise into insights and manual tasks into automated actions, powered by BigPanda. I'm your host, Craig Ferrara. Join me as I talk to tech experts and people from different walks of life, sharing great insights, the latest trends, and relevant topics about ITOps and AIOps. This is That's Great IT, powered by BigPanda. All right, and we're back. Now, for those of you who are listening, we are joined today by Brady Pannabecker, who's actually at BigPanda with me. He is a senior adoption advisor here, working with our customers all the time on configuration, on considerations in IT automation workflow. And today, what we're going to be talking about is some of the foundational elements of applying automation to your IT operational workflows. And I think it's a great topic because we've heard a little bit, in some of our other episodes about modernization of IT operations, where we're currently going. We've heard a little bit about healthcare and that side of IT and IT operation. But what we want to do is just make sure we're covering some of the basics as well. And so real quick, Brady, just introduce yourself. I'd love to get to know you a little bit as we go through this episode.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, and happy to be part of the program. I've been at BigPanda now almost 4 years, which feels like half a lifetime. Prior to that, my first job that wasn't making coffee for a living was actually working in a 24/7 critical support environment for production applications. I was a software support specialist at HP back when it was one HP. Ended up running that team, which also owned our network operations center at the time. So familiar with getting bombed and flooded with alerts and having to respond at all hours of the day to make sure that the lights stay on. Went from there and worked in a couple other environments where I was helping run an SRE team and run customer support and support organizations, and landed at BigPanda in a sense when I saw what they were doing and said, man, I would have given a limb for that about a decade ago, to have a tool to help the NOC team survive. It's really critical to keep those groups from getting flooded with stuff. So I'm here working with our customers and helping them best manage their operations in a way that lets their people sleep at night. That's really the goal.
No, that's really why I was so interested in having you on the podcast, Brady, and in the future having you host a few sessions with some of our guests as well. It's specifically because of that history, but also that history gives us a pretty unique perspective on what we know a lot of the companies that we work with are going through, and what a lot of these NOC teams in multiple industries are going through, as you put it, keeping the lights on. And while in some episodes, we definitely like focusing on broad topics, where's the industry going? What's the future look like? Where have we been and how have things improved? I thought today would be, not only in introducing you, but in kind of helping set a voice and a tone for this podcast series in general, to also just talk about small topics, really, topics that are very narrow, I should say, and thinking about what are some tangible things that we want our audience thinking about. As much as we want them to understand history and predictions and things like that, what are just some of in this case today, some of the foundational elements for applying automation to IT operations? And we throw around the term AIOps all the time, and very broad, right? Kind of a Google search term is what it's become. Exactly, right? And it gets thrown around so much, but I can't go to an engineer and say, all right, we're deploying AIOps today. I mean, they're going to look at you like, what does that, what am I supposed to do with that? So let's talk about it, right? Because applying automation to IT operations is a great start to thinking through AIOps. And, let me just ask you, if we're going to talk about different topics today as a foundation, what are some of those things that people will be thinking about? We'll go into each one of these, but what are some of those things that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to my journey, right? And we started with a little bit of a leg up at HP in that we had inherited a lot of run books. We'd inherited a bunch of data from our monitoring teams and from our operations teams. And at some point, we had to take the steps and really kind of uh, settle the waters in order to start working effectively. And back then, we had no real automation. Right? The idea of automatically opening a ticket would have been magical. But even then, as we look to today and the data that companies have and what they're working with, a lot of it starts with sort of uh, setting a standard, right? The NOC teams are going to get flooded with information if you just open the taps. And so saying, hey, like we're going to go through and make sure that all of our monitors have at least this baseline of data in there. What application is it supporting? Which team owns it? What are the core connections that it has with other systems? Uh, Not everything, not a full CMDB. A lot of people will panic and say, "Oh, you're just telling us to build a CMDB," and CMDB and ITIL are dirty words. Let's not dwell on that, right? Like, let's just get the base level of information that we need. From there, if you have stuff like a CMDB, awesome, right? Let's leverage those sort of common layers of enrichment and say, we know these things are related because of X. Maybe it's tribal knowledge. Maybe it's a discovery program that you've got running that's doing network connections and whatnot inside the infrastructure. Maybe your team documents stuff really well and you've got it all in a spreadsheet. Awesome. Like take that and run with it. I think having that foundation of, we have a core template we're working on. This is the structure that we need in the alert, and then from there you can build and iterate on that. And that helps you group stuff together too, right? As you're building out to like, how do we know these are related? They have the same system that somebody wrote. They're supporting the same network component that somebody noted down, and that helps you group stuff together. I think
So
that's the. Go ahead.
no. So we commonly refer to this, and I think people who have probably attended some of the webinars and things like that, but we commonly refer to this as alert payload standardization.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if we're taking this kind of templated approach to the inbound alert payloads that
Mm-hmm.
are supposed to be coming in, what are some of the challenges that you see in that? I mean, not everybody can do it right away.
Not
And of
everybody
course,
can.
not
Yeah.
everybody. Not I would challenge us to find someone that I've worked with or you've worked with that has it done to 100%.
Yeah, and most of the time it's not. And I think, it's a common hiccup, right? Hey, my CMDB is incomplete, I can't use it. That's absolutely false. Any contextual data you have to be able to add to an alert, great, do it. But I think in terms of setting a standard, like some of the pitfalls that we see, that I've seen like over the years, the monitoring team and your operations team or your NOC, your frontline team, your SOC, whatever we're going to call them, they don't talk. And so some of this is like technology is great. Tools like BigPanda, cool. We can add enrichment. We don't need a CMDB. You can go in and add a little node or add a quick, hey, a post is equal to X, add this data. That's all wonderful. But some of this becomes a people problem, right? And we need to sort of like open the lines of communication between the monitoring and operations team or your DevOps group that's building out the monitoring and the group that's going to be responding to those alerts. Once you have that, those teams can respond and say, hey, like, we'd love to take your alerts instead of just paging you in the middle of the night. Give us a run book. And if you give us a run book and an impacted service and a priority, then we'll try and run it. And if we can't run it, we'll open a ticket with the appropriate priority and only page the right people instead of blasting the whole team. Um, all of this is going to like reduce the number of people having to respond to incidents and speed the resolution. Um, so, pitfall, you got to make your NOC, at least they have to be able to go sell the idea upstream, right? To help the rest of the team or understand the benefit of this sort of standardization, and the sort of automation it can power. So I think like there's a level of de-siloing and removing those silos in communication that'll help expand the adoption or at least maximize the impact of an AIOps initiative, if we're going to call it that.
Now, not to take us down a rabbit hole, but do you have any good stories about how Knox helped to enforce these standardizations?
Yeah, yeah. I won't name names, but there's, so a lot of times you'll have engineering teams will operate out of a system like Jira, for example, and they're going to run bug tickets or various tickets that get dropped into a project or a sprint for them to work on. And we have had NOCs in the past come to their engineering teams and say, hey, we receive all your alerts. It's overwhelming. It's a ton of noise. If you want us to work on them, here's the minimum payload we need to have. Runbook, service owner, even if it's just those 2 data points. And they actually went through and put in the legwork and said, hey, like, if it doesn't have those 2 pieces of data, we're going to mark it as missing a particular level of enrichment or a particular level of alert quality. That's another phrase you'll probably hear thrown around a bit, is alert quality. And when they found alerts that didn't match that spec, they opened a JIRA ticket for the operations team. And this particular frontline team was savvy enough where they automated that. So you can imagine the thrill of their operations teams to wake up on a Monday morning after an alert storm over the weekend and have a few hundred JIRAs in the backlog to say, please go update this monitor so that it meets the spec, or we're going to stop responding to it. Which, yeah, I hate to be on the other end of that. So there's a little bit of like enforcement through shame, right? Which I don't think is the right way to go. I think a collaborative approach is best, but in lieu of that, it's important to put the work where it belongs, right? And if your operations teams aren't going to help the NOC, let the operations teams help themselves.
Though, I agree. We don't want to create division. We want to create unity. And even if you're not generating tickets, I am such a fan of the misconfigured tag, right? Or the value associated. Oh man. And even if it has like a misconfigured code, right? Missing X, missing X, Y, and Z, for example. And then being able to report on that. So even if you're not, let's say, spamming these operation groups, but being able to provide, I do love the idea of action through shaming. If I can produce a report at the end of a quarter, at the end of a month, or a weekly, that just says, by the way, here's everything that we accomplished. Here's how we were solving everything by priority, MTTX, you name it. But then also here's the sources of all of our misconfigured alerts.
Sure. Well, and I'll say a lot of the time what we see through that analysis, when you look at it that way, is there is a business case to be made for setting those standards. If you can give the NOC a runbook and they can resolve it at first point of contact, then you didn't wake up an engineer whose salary might be 2 or 3x a NOC operator's to then spend time off hours working on something, or even if it's during the workday, to break their productivity, right? We talk a lot about flow state. And if you've got people working and building and sitting and they're focused and doing focused work, and a P1 comes through on their pager and says, hey, you need to stop what you're doing right now and go look at this, to then try and come back after documenting all that work you just did and get back into the kind of the deeper work that you were on. It's really costly. And so I think even the business case you could make, if you can articulate, hey, here's how much stuff didn't meet the NOC spec, right? The frontline team spec, and therefore was passed immediately to an L2 or an L3 engineer to get work. If I'm an IT or DevOps or operations executive, and you came to me with that pitch and said, hey, we need other teams to get on this. Maybe I need a headcount or 2 in the NOC to manage that additional work that's going to be coming in that we're removing from those higher level resources. It lets them focus on the stuff that they're not firefighting anymore, right? They're building resilient infrastructure that's not going to burst into flames. But that's the goal.
Right.
Where your NOC team can then take those steps to say, hey, like the stuff that's defined and repeatable and documented, we're going to take care of, rather than waking somebody up. And that, sure, you could see that through a JIRA backlog, but to your point, looking at the analysis and saying, where are these non-compliant tickets coming from? And how much is that costing us? Because the stuff that is compliant has a resolution time that's 3 or 4x lower.
Now, for our listeners here, important to note, we're talking today about laying a foundation for automation. Alerts, payload, standardization, and governance, hugely, hugely valuable. Doesn't necessarily in and of itself represent automation. But just hearing about this, though, you realize when we start to get to the point where we're talking about automation of, bundling alerts together by potential source or root cause or prioritization, which we're going to talk about next. This is so foundational to it, even before you get into the concept of automating anything, that it's worthy to spend 10 or 15 minutes of a 30-minute podcast just talking about
Yeah,
this and talking about reporting against misconfigurations to reduce those internally. It is so foundational to what you're doing to have good alert payloads and some type of governance and standardization in there so that your NOC teams can respond and know what to expect when they're receiving these alerts. But let's
100%.
let's go down let's go down the conversion funnel of automation one layer. And we talked a little bit about standardization, maybe even some enrichment if we're talking about incomplete CMDB data, even having anything related to topology or service mapping. Wonderful. So let's assume at this point, hey, we have a current state of standardization. We've got some enrichments in place that are helping us through creating high quality alert payloads. If we're thinking about the concept of automation and we look then next towards the decisions that a business or a NOC is making around how to correlate things together, what are some of the things, Brady, that we should be thinking about when we're starting to plan for building correlation?
Yeah, I think it's well, one, right? Why correlate at all? Right? Why are we worried about grouping alerts together in the first place? Um, Small story there. If you automated something with no correlation, you're just moving the volume from one place to another. Um, Small segue. Back at another job when I was working with a NOC, we were receiving all of our alerts through email, which shouldn't be all that unfamiliar for some of our listeners that have been around for a while. And we had an alert storm. Data center went down. And it was so much volume that it took out our local Outlook server. And so then we were blind. And so you say, okay, well, step one, let's reduce the volume a little bit. Um, Correlation is, I think, the intelligent way of reducing that volume. We could just say, hey, only send me every N alerts. But I think the ability to say, let's group these together in a logical way, a way that makes sense, a way that respects that standardized payload and all the work that we've just put into setting the foundation. And that should drop the volume by at least half in most cases. And so if we can say, hey, we've tagged these alerts, we've added additional data through enrichment, through our CMDB, through whatever we have around upstream systems, downstream impact, product owners, location, network component, application that's supported. Those are all, kind of groupings that you can put together that make sense in a logical fashion. You can say, hey, we have 5 alerts in the last few minutes that all have the same downstream application that they support. Well, great. There's a good chance they're related. And so we'll bundle those together, show them to the operator. There's that person can then validate, yep, all these things are related, we know. And if there's any other sort of hierarchical data or information they have in terms of where the root might be, rather than just the impact of the blast radius. I think that's going to be the goal of correlation, is to try and have you land as close to the root of the issue as you can, and let the teams triage from there.
And to your point, not necessarily losing data in the process, because if you're reducing volume by saying only show me every n number of alerts, or you're saying maybe you're adjusting alerting thresholds so that you're closer to pain before, and not seeing quite as much prior to something service degradation or something falling over, that's another kind of blunt tool to reduce volume, but it's not a very, say, intelligent or thinking of IT automation and AIOps. It's not a very AIOps way of doing things.
Sure. One of my least favorite words in ITOps is proactive. And the reason it's an issue for me is a lot of people, when they say proactive, what they mean is precognitive, right? Hey, fix this before it becomes an issue. And you can't do that if you're tuning your alert thresholds to the point where it only tells you when something's actually broken. But you can't be proactive if your monitoring thresholds are so insensitive that you're flooded with noise. So you need a way to take noisy signal that might be a warning or a informational, hey, this volume is filling up quickly, or disk space just changed rapidly over time, or CPU utilization, or network bandwidth just dropped. Those sorts of things that may not necessarily indicate a critical failure, but definitely are worthy of attention. You need a way to take all of those noisy data streams and pull them into one event that an operator can look at and say, hey, like something might be starting to fail, right? These are the indicators of potential failure. And get it to a point where the team can work on that rather than being overwhelmed by that and defaulting to, hey, only tell me when it tips over. Because at that point, you've already impacted your clients, internal or external.
Matter of opinion here, but where would you go internally if you're thinking about, hey, I need to build this library of correlation definitions? Who are you talking to internally to start building? Because, these things are maintained over time and they're optimized over time, but where do you start? Do you start at the operators, the first line of defense saying, how do you guys want things bundled? Or are we talking to, service owners and DevOps teams?
Yeah, I think it probably depends. And I know that's not the most helpful answer in the world. My bias is for the knock, and that's because that's where I grew up. And I tend to figure the people in the trenches understand how incidents evolve. And at the same time, I'll say, even being here at BigPanda and being exposed to the product architecture and how things are built, it is super helpful at that level of initial triage to understand how those components are connected. So I would say, like, let the knock tell you what's helpful, because a lot of times through that tribal experience, through that sort of being in there for major incidents, they'll be able to tell you, yeah, those look like they're related, but they're really not because of this. And that information is invaluable. But I will say, if you're starting from a blank slate, don't have a frontline team, you've got DevOps people running around with their hair on fire trying to keep things alive, or your application team is supporting it in flight. Start with the application architecture. What components are involved in holding this together, right? And which of those components are the most sensitive or the most critical? Non-redundant infrastructure, that sort of stuff where you're saying, like, this is a bottleneck, and if this goes down, the whole thing tips over. Great. Like, capture that information and see if there's a way you can cluster around those relationships, and then let the knock tell you what's real.
It's kind of and forgive me, maybe we'll even cut this if I use this incorrectly, but it's kind of a catch-22. And I think I know what that means, but I might not. So, again, post-editing is going to be a gem here for us. But, you've got this idea that I need to have standardized alert payloads. Those standardized alert payloads enable correlation because they contain the data that you'd be using to correlate alerts together and bundle them, right? But you could also approach it in reverse to say, here are the requirements that we have as a NOC, and let those requirements inform your alert payload standards. Yeah. Right? It works in both directions.
Yeah. And I'll say, like, the comment on having the NOC do it and why sometimes that can be really helpful has to do with operational workflow. And it could be that in most cases, an application gets spun out, it's live in production. You may not have a full stack team managing that application once it's live. You got developers that are doing app support in case there's some bug that's figured out in the code base. A lot of times, once something's out there and running, maybe you've got a network team, maybe you've got a server team, maybe you've got, an application team. Great. Who do you escalate what to? You can't just say, hey, my payments app is down, I'm going to ping the entire payments team. Well, what part of your payments app is down, right? And there's going to be cases where the NOC is the group that's able to make that determination, where they say, hey, we got a bunch of network alerts come in for the payments app. And then 5 minutes later, our front end monitoring, our APM or something, told me that the app was down. And the guys in the NOC are sitting there going, well, duh, the network's having an issue. No need to wake up the application guy, right? You wake up the network team. And I think that's sort of where, like, yeah, catch 22, like, what do you build first, right? Is fish or cut bait? I got to do something. It sort of depends on where you're starting. And then it also sort of depends on, like, what the expectations are for the NOC in terms of incident management, incident workflow. Some groups have an actual incident manager somewhere where the NOC says, hey, we're having a problem, pull the ripcord, and the incident manager then is doing the coordination between the teams. So the correlation in that case, the NOC can say, hey, I got 10 network alerts, 2 application alerts, and 2 database alerts. And they've chosen not to group those all together in one larger incident, to keep them as distinct entities, and then use the timing of when those came in to help drive a conversation at the incident level around, hey, this is what we believe the timeline of events to be, and this is where we think we should start triage. Um, Again, it's sort of, uh, it's there's no right way to do it as long as you're
Yeah.
doing it right.
There's
Like
no, there's no
it's
right way to use that term either. It could be a catch 23 at this point. It just depends where you're starting from.
yeah, yeah.
When in Rome.
In IT operations, we know a lot about juggling, so we could just it's you catch until something falls. That's the it's one of those things where the workflow is going to drive some of the correlation requirements. And again, right, like most people listening to this, most people we work with, they're not starting from nothing.
Right.
There's somebody there that's been working, that's been trying to manage this, that is then saying, hey, part of this is untenable, it's unscalable, we can't keep doing it the way we're doing. How do we take that next step towards automating X?
Mm-hmm.
And the first step for a lot of these customers that we work with is, hey, can you guys just open a ticket for me?
Yeah.
And that sounds so simple. And like we've been saying, laying that groundwork lets you drive correlation, lets you drive better context so that when I open a ticket, it goes to the right person. It has enough
Right.
information for them to start working on it. Because otherwise, like I said, you're just taking work that's happening somewhere and moving it somewhere else. And there's no point investing a bunch of energy and time and money to just shuffle work from one place to another.
Right.
If we're gonna do something, let's make sure it has a material impact on the uptime and availability of the application and on the quality of life for the people involved working on it.
So let's talk about, and what we'll do is we'll kind of wrap on this topic today. Prioritization and routing, right? Because good correlation does reduce event volume that your operators are exposed to and alert fatigue, but it's kind of only part of the story, right? Okay, now we have a quantity of work that is more manageable than it was yesterday. But it's still important for me to understand when I'm looking at 500 things that have come in and our operations center is staffed to handle 500 things. We still want to know what we're working on first.
Yeah.
So thinking of prioritization and routing as kind of a very, this is all related topic, right? We're not talking about, building table chairs and making ice cream, but it's all related. But prioritization and routing as kind of a single topic here in this workflow. Where do you start? Where have you started in the past when you've done your own prioritization?
Yeah, I think so. The easiest way, and again, like where we talked, do you start at the application infrastructure design or do you start with the NOC? I think this conversation, if we're starting from close to scratch, is best served by starting with the NOC or your incident management team that's responding to postmortems. You have a P1. Why did we have a P1? When we get down to the root of, hey, we had this big outage, we know what failed, and now we know what to look for next time. The minute you can say we know what to look for next time, right? Figure out how to programmatically get that into your system, right? I don't care if it's an email filter that says, hey, if something comes through with this keywords in the subject, mark it as super important and, blow up my inbox with it. Great. In BigPanda, we can mark it as P1 using an incident tag. When that gets shared out to your ticketing system, we can have that marked as a P1. I think starting from a prioritization of, in the past, we know that these types of alerts or these types of correlated alerts into an incident have caused major outages. Great. Let's make sure that we're responding appropriately if we see that same pattern or that same subset of data come in. And then routing, that comes down to ownership, right? Like a lot of times the NOC is the backstop for everything. But you might have a situation where you say, hey, we want the NOC to see this. And in parallel, we want to make sure we engage the right teams. And so that routing component, I think, is also driven at some level by that alert payload and standardization. If you have, the notion of a service owner for an application, or, here's the people on the network team that you're going to need to reach out to for this type of stuff, add it to your alert payload, enrich it somewhere. So that when the NOC gets it, they know where to route it to. If a human's doing the routing, if you go the method of having a machine do the routing for you, then that information is absolutely critical, because it's garbage in, garbage out. Start
Mhm.
with good signals, start with where you know it's going, um, mark it if you know it's going to cause an outage, and then wake up the right people, or give it to the knock because we're always awake.
Now, when we're working with companies that are establishing prioritizations where others may not have existed,
Mhm.
what at least what I've been exposed to is you'll usually get something that notes as a P1 and then
Mhm.
everything else. And the reason they
Yeah.
call a P1 is because it either has a customer or direct revenue impact,
Yep.
right? And that's considered P1. And then everything else is just not that,
Yeah.
right? And
I was
so,
actually was talking with a client this morning. Sorry to jump in.
yeah,
That where every ticket we open from BigPanda starts as P3 and it goes to the knock. And then from there, the knock does the initial triage. They leverage their own institutional knowledge and then they adjust the priority. Um, and when you look at the volume by priority for that particular client, it's way skewed towards P3, um, which is fine. And it lets me know that, hey, there's probably stuff that we're missing that's either P1 or P2. Maybe it's not a complete outage or revenue impact, but we need to look at how we can programmatically, right, adjust that priority so that you're not having to rely so much on people going through and filtering the data. But yeah, for most customers, P1 or not. And it's almost a binary.
yeah. And I think what you just described is probably, a good crawl phase of a crawl, walk, run
Mm-hmm.
approach to automated prioritizations. And
Yeah.
you know, it's a maturity scale. I think a very
Yeah.
mature organization has strict definitions of what it means to be a P1, a P2, a P3 through
Yeah.
and I honestly I've seen up to P15, which great. If you've got that level of granularity and it's meaningful, good for you. But I'm a fan of just the classic P1 through P5, even
Yeah.
P4.
And not to harp on it too much, right? But the priority definitions are great. Those are great. It's nice to have those. You need to be able to identify them. And that's where coming back to the payload standardization and correlation is going to help you get to the point where you can say, hey, we have these definitions and they're something that we can programmatically put in place to where it's not a human having to do that validation. And that's where I think the most benefit comes from.
So let's try to wrap this up and put a nice little bow on it for today's episode. And I'll start with one just kind of closing thought from my perspective here, which is we've talked about alert payload standardization, helping to create complete alert payloads. We've talked about correlation. We've talked about prioritization and routing. If you have even just a general idea of what you would like to happen within your organization, you've got a good foundation, I think, then for what you want to try and configure in the technology you have at hand. Just having that idea of what you want to do can provide a lot of guidance to your knock, can provide a lot of guidance to your teams that are responsible for your technology stack. And it doesn't matter if you start from square one or square five and work in reverse, right? If you know, hey, here's how I want things prioritized and routed, but in order to do that, we need to bundle our incidents this way. But in order to do that, we at least have to have this data on our alert payloads. Or if you're starting from the beginning, our alert payloads are all over the place. Let's just set a definition for what that looks like and then see what we're capable of doing with regards to correlation. You can start at either end of things, but looking at this as we'll say very basic, but kind of complete story, starting at your observability tools and ending at how your incidents are prioritized and routed. If you think about the full picture, you're setting a good foundation for automation. Brady, closing thoughts. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key here is to start somewhere, right? And actually start moving. Easy to have decision paralysis, easy to sit and say, if it's not perfect, we shouldn't do it. I think both of those are traps. I think decide where you have pain, either work forward from that pain or backwards from that pain to figure out what you need. Um, and then just start doing it. And your teams will appreciate whatever effort you put in, even if it's something as simple as, hey, can you please open a ticket for me? I think that's a win for everybody involved. But you got to start somewhere.
Brady Pannabecker, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do look forward to having you back. We're going to likely have a few episodes where we dive really, really deep into these topics and talk about great correlation patterns, governance models just for correlation, or the nuances of looking at reporting and analytics of prioritizations and things like that. But incredibly valuable insights today. And again, I really look forward to having you back on the show. So thank you so much for being here.
That's been my pleasure. I can't wait to come back.
That was great. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been That's Great IT, your one-stop place to learn about ITOps and AIOps, powered by BigPanda. Catch us on our next episode.